Thank you very much to the organizer of this meeting, Pietro, Riccardo, and all the others for inviting me. I am very happy and glad and honored to be here. There has been tremendous advances in the last years in our understanding of animal cognition, but whether this has been, say, escorted by a similar advances in our understanding of animal consciousness, well, is debatable, I think. And the reason of my doubts is not related to philosophical or logical arguments related to the obvious difficulty to penetrate the experience of other creatures, because it is true also for our own species, but it is related to empirical evidence. So let me try to share with you some of my pessimistic view, and then I will try at the end to say something more positive. I will use examples from my own research, not because it is particularly valuable, but simply because I know it better. For instance, there is quite a lot of evidence now that animals are able to deal with numerosities. We also contributed to that, for instance, using our young chicks and the filial imprinting as a technique, as a method. You are probably familiar with filial imprinting. It's the learning process by which the young of some animals, usually of precocial species, learn to recognize their mother or social partner by being simply exposed to it for a very short period soon after hatching. And usually it's the mother hen, but an artificial object is also quite effective. They develop a strong social attachment to the object, and we can use it to look at a sort of numerical cognition. For instance, we can rear chicks with a different number of imprinting objects and then look for their performances when they are tested in a free choice tasks for their preferences for a different number of imprinting objects. And what happens in this experiment is that usually chicks go for more. Namely, if they have been reared with 3 objects, they prefer 3 objects, but they also prefer 3 objects if they have been reared with 2 objects. And this is very sensible from an ethological point of view, of course, but you can say, well, that's really not number. They are perceiving the stuff which is here, so we can try something more sophisticated, looking whether they are able to do that on the basis of memory rather than on direct perception. So the chick is confined behind a transparent partition and could observe one after the other 3 objects moving and disappearing behind the screen on the right, and 2 objects disappearing behind the screen on the on the left, and 2 on the right. And that could be done sequentially or even simultaneously as a group. And then after a delay, the chick is allowed to search for the object. You can see here an example. So one imprinting object is moving behind the screen on the right side, and then the move is speed up in such a way to spare some time. 2 objects, 3, and then 1 and 2 on the other side. And they could decide which one of 2 screens would approach. Of course, it is memory, but it's quite possible that they are using the continuous physical variables that are co-vary with numerosity, because we are not dealing with symbols here, but with actual stimuli. And so to check for that, we should use, for instance, 2-dimensional stimuli and check and control for continuous physical variables like the overall surface or the contour length, and the results suggest that chicks are still able to discriminate the numerosity. This obviously of the continuous physical variables is quite serious problem in this field of research. Recently, we developed a script to deal with the different aspects of these continuous physical variables and to present them in control conditions and we tested these fish, which are interesting by themselves, the archer fish, that they produce they spit some water to prey, and they can be trained to do that to stimuli placed on monitor screen over the top, and the dots are different in the different quantitative aspects and different also in numerosity. I can show you an example of the performance of the archer fish in this task. So this is a discrimination 3 versus 6, and you can observe that the physical characteristics of the dots are continuously changing from trial to trial, as well as the left-right position, and they are quite good at discriminating the numerosities. Yes, this is an example of the learning curves. There is no difference between learning with 3 as the rewarded or 6 as the rewarded stimulus. We also know something about the neural basis of these abilities. And recently, because we are interested in the innate mechanisms underlying this kind of ability, we were able to record in very young chicks, few days old. They were simply presented with stimuli in controlled condition, and we record from single neurons in a region which is called nidopallium caudolaterale, presumed equivalent of the prefrontal cortex. We found about 11% of neurons selectivity, showing selectivity to numerosity. I can show you an example of these neurons. This is a neuron responding to 5, but not to 1, for instance. The physical characteristic of the stimulus is controlled in the various trials in such a way that overall area, control length, and so on is controlled. And you can see a burst of activity when 5 is presented, but not when 1, for instance, is presented, or other velocities. And the tuning curves that can be obtained these sort of experiments are very similar to the tuning curve which has been described for monkeys, for instance. So this is, for instance, the neuron responded to number 3, and you can see it has a peak for number 3 and a decrease responses for number 2 and number 1, and on the other side for number 4 and number 5. And of course, the tuning curves are skewed towards larger numerosities, and also they become wider with increase in numerosity, which are the typical signature of the Weber law, on which obviously the number sense, this approximate number system, is based. It is a true numerical system, though it is approximate, because it allows performing the arithmetic operation. There is a lot of evidence for that. Show you some of the things we did with chicks, for instance. It's similar to the previous condition. And in this case, there is addition and subtraction. So one imprinting object is moving and disappearing behind the screen on the right, and then one on the screen on the left, another 1, 2, and then another 3, and another 1, 4. But at this point, to make things more complicated, there is a subtraction, and one of the imprinting objects is moving visibly from the screen to the left to the right in this way, and another one this way. So at this point, if the chick is able to maintain in memory or update its memory of the different addition and subtraction, we should expect that it would be able to choose this screen. I can anticipate your objection, obviously, because this is the screen behind which, for the very last time, the imprinting object has been seen to disappear, so it is in working memory. But we can check for that. Let's try a control condition starting again for 4 versus 1. And in this case, we make just one subtraction, such a way, this is the screen behind which it has been seen for the last time disappearing the object, but in this case, the correct computation of the series of addition and subtraction should be this one. And in fact, chicks were able to solve this kind of task quite surprisingly, as shown here. Again, I can show you an example. This is actually done for a documentary film for television, so it's reproducing in a rough way the real conditions. And of course, there is no music during the experiment. So there is an imprinting object disappearing behind the screen on one side, and then another. If you are not familiar with the visual system of birds, you could have the impression that it's not attentive, but actually they have a different organization of the fovea. So for objects which are far away, they turn and look with the lateral field of vision. So they are attentive, but in a way which is different with respect to foveal perception in mammalian species. This pointer is the subtraction from the screen to the right to the screen to the left side. And then choice. It's pondering a little bit because you know mathematics is difficult indeed. And then choose the correct corner. Okay, you may be surprised, this is in a sense astonishing, but is there any evidence for that our chicks should be conscious because they are able to do that? Well, I doubt that very much. Look at this experiment. It is not a novel one, but it occurred to me recently. This is a work done by colleagues in Tel Aviv. Fantastic. They presented to one eye a simple arithmetic operation, 9 minus 3 minus 4, and they use a technique which is called flashing suppression. So to the other eye, this is a Mondrian stimulus flashing, and the result is that there is complete disappearance of any conscious experience in this case. The people don't see the stimuli, so they don't see the digits, they don't see the symbols for minus and so on. But then, after this priming, if you ask people to read as quick as possible different digits number, you could observe that the number that would correspond to the correct arithmetic, that is 2 in this case, show a facilitation effect. It's quite a striking phenomenon of about 20 milliseconds or 10 milliseconds depending on the duration. So the conclusion seems to me that if humans are able to do arithmetic without any consciousness, there is no evidence in any way that the fact that chicks or other creatures are able to do arithmetic is evidence that they are conscious. Consider another example. This is relative to a phenomenon you are probably familiar with, the mental number line, which has been described by Charles Darwin, Cushing, Francis Galton in 1861. And it is the phenomenon according to which people spontaneously organize numbers in space, and they tend, not all, but most people tend to locate small numbers to the left and large number to the right. And the traditional explanation for this has been that it is something related to cultural and societal habits. And in fact, there is quite convincing evidence that in people that have different reading and writing habits, there could be modulation and sometimes even reversal of this phenomenon. So a few years ago, we published a paper that was produced some puzzlement among cognitive scientists, showing that chicks might show the equivalent of a mental number line. And the experiment is extremely simple. We presented chicks with a number on a panel, and the chick has to circumvent, to detour the panel to get a reward, a mealworm. And the panel is marked by a certain numerosity, 5 in this case, which is changing from trial to trial. And then it is simply presented with 2 panels, with a smaller numerosity, 2, or with a larger numerosity, 8. And what we found is that when the numerosity is lower, chicks tend to go to the left, and when it is larger, they go to the right. And this is an example of the experiment. Obviously, training is very easy for the chick, it's very simple. And this is a lazy chick, actually, but he is coming. And there is no bias during training to the tour, to the left or to the right side, actually. But then, when the test is small, they go to the left. And when number is large, they go to the right. Obviously, small and large depends on previous experience, on the target. So, for instance, here, 8 is large. But imagine a condition in which they are trained with 20 rather than with 5 dots, like this one. So training is with 20. And then chicks are presented with 8, which is smaller this time. They go to the left. Or 32 is larger. They go to the right. Okay, this is the kind of data we have got. And then the experiment has been duplicated with human newborns in our lab and in another lab in France. And last year, Martin Jurfa has duplicated exactly the same procedure we use with chicks with honeybees. So honeybees also show the same mental number-like phenomenon. Again, this seems to be astonishing, but is it really in contrast with previous evidence and with anthropological evidence, or tell us anything about consciousness? Well, recently, with a group of colleagues working in cognitive anthropology, Serge Caparros and Mathilde Josserand, we tried to test 3 different populations. Italian adults, Himba, which is a traditional population in Namibia, in 2 field trips in 2021 and 22, and they have only oral culture. They have no any formal arithmetic, and preschooler Italian children. And what we found, little surprising, is that if they are tested in explicit tasks, like the traditional task in which there is non-symbolic numerosity and they have to order them, you can see an example here of a young lady of the Himba population doing explicit tasks. What we found is perfectly congruent and fit with previous evidences, namely Italian adults show a clear ordering to left to right, but not the Himba and not the Italian preschooler. Fine, but if you test these guys with an implicit task of this sort, they are presented with a certain numerosity as a priming, and then after a while there is presentation of a larger or a smaller numerosity. The task is simply to judge whether it is larger or smaller in congruent or incongruent condition. So for instance, when you are requested to press when less, congruent is that the small number is on the left, and incongruent, the small number is on the right, or vice versa, press when more is on the right or on the left. Well, in this kind of implicit tasks, all 3 populations, Himbas, human Italian adults, and preschooler Italian, show exactly the same effect. So again, this is interesting in itself with respect to the story of the mental number line, but it is also telling again that this kind of evidence for sophisticated cognition tell us nothing about consciousness in itself. There are some other examples I would like to show briefly. One is evidence for geometry. Let's try a simple IQ test on you if you want. Imagine you are located into a rectangular environment like this, and there is something terribly interesting in one corner, corner A. And then you are blindfolded, slowly rotated clockwise and anti-clockwise in such a way to obtain complete spatial disorientation. And then, after that, you restore your vision, and the goal object is no longer visible. And your task is to figure out what could have been the correct corner. When I ask this in the form of paper and pencil version as a test in class, for instance, my students say, well, if everything is done well, if there are no small signs or other cues in the environment, there is no solution. So what I would expect is completely random choices, 25% probability for each of the corners. But it is not so, actually, because this is a rectangular shape, not a square shape. And in a rectangular shape, you can use simple Euclidean geometry to partial, not completely, but to partial disambiguate the task. In fact, when you are facing corner A, you have on the right a short wall, and on the left a long wall. And there is only one other location, another corner, that's staying in the same geometrical relationship with respect to the arrangement of the surfaces. And this is the rotational equivalent on the corner C. So you cannot distinguish corner A and corner C, but you can distinguish corner AC from corner DB. So if you are rational creatures, that would be the expected outcome. But when people are presented in this paper and pencil version, they are not able to solve the task. But if they are located into the room, they do the right thing. And they are not able to say why that particular corner looks correct. And there is plenty of evidence that animals can do that. These are, for instance, zebrafish tested in my lab. And in this case, the four corners are associated with doors that are open or closed. And you will see that in this case, one of the doors which is selected is actually blocked. And after a while, the fish move and select the geometrically equivalent location, which is the correct one. And similarly, there is plenty of work which has been done in humans. This is my former postdoc, Sang Ali. This is the laboratory of Elizabeth Spelke at Harvard that has this beautiful, completely homogeneous environment. And the sticker has been located in this position. And then the child is spatially disoriented. Looking and pondering. And then it makes the rotational errors. What is fascinating of this ability is that they seems to be available very early during development. We recently performed an experiment with chicks in which we made available experience of extended surfaces soon after hatching, together with experience and attachment with an imprinting object. So the condition is something like that. Soon after hatching, the chick is located in a transparent partition, and it could observe an imprinting object moving and disappearing behind a grid in one corner. After that, it is passively disoriented by moving clockwise and anti-clockwise. Four identical objects are placed in the different corners, and at this point is allowed to search. And you can see that there is no random search in this case, but there is prevalent search significantly different in the two geometrically correct locations that cannot be distinguished, obviously, from the other, but they can be distinguished from the other geometrically incorrect location. Final example is logic. Again, you are probably familiar with all the evidence for transitive inference in animals, and transitive inference is the sort of things that can be described verbally. If Alan is taller than Boris, and Boris is taller than Charles, then who is taller, Alan or Charles? Obviously, the correct logical answer is Alan. For a long time, psychologists believed that was possible this only after the development of the symbolic function. That was the position of Piaget, for instance. But now we know that properly tested, a variety of animals are able to perform transitive inference. For instance, in young chicks, this can be obtained this way. There is a series of symbols, and chicks are trained with the premises of the problem, so A, B, and the correct one is the red circle, and then B, C, the correct one is the square, and the correct one is the rhombus, and then the cross, and this is intermixed until the animals learn all the possible, all the single pairs. And then the animal is presented with the BD conditions, which are stimuli that have been already seen, but not in a particular condition. And note that from the associative point of view, B and D have been rewarded, and not rewarded exactly the same number of times. In fact, it was rewarded, B is not rewarded here, and it is rewarded here. Similarly, D is not rewarded here, but it is rewarded here. So there is no apparently basis in associative term to do the distinction, but they do that, but not just chicks, but also wasps, rats, crows, monkeys. A variety of creatures are being studied. And just as a tribute to the doctrine of the social function of intellect, recently we tried to see whether there is a relationship between social rank and the ability to solve transitive inference in chicks. Chicks have this characteristic that they have social ranks from the start, from the very few days, early days. And you can see that in females, for instance, the females of the lower rank are also the best in solving the transitive inference problem. They are better than the middle rank and clearly better than the higher rank individuals. In males, there is something similar, but those of very low rank are not very good, probably because they are stressed, or in any case, they feel there is no chance to grow up along the social hierarchy. So, even in this case, there is evidence from human studies that even performing transitive inference does not require consciousness. There's this beautiful and I think very little known experiment carried out by Juan Delius, who tested university students in a transitive inference task. And the crucial test in this case is BE comparison. And he found that part of the students, not all, were able to solve the task, but the group of the solvers was not homogeneous. There was about 1/2 that were explicit solvers. That is, when asked after the experiment, they were able to explain you why they select B with respect to E, and they were able to order the stimuli from A, B, C, etc. But another 1/2 of the subjects were completely blind from the cognitive point of view. And they say, when I was presented with the pair BE, I simply guess. So they are, in a sense, the equivalent on the cognitive domain of the blind side people in the visual domain. And if you look at the reaction time and at the errors, there is no difference between the implicit and the explicit solvers. So the short story is that, of course, nothing novel. Studying cognition and documenting sophisticated intellectual abilities in animal species is, in a sense, a different problem than the problem of addressing the issue of consciousness and sentience. So with respect to sentience and consciousness, I'm trying to follow the path described and put forward in his beautiful talk by Nick Humphrey on Tuesday. And his starting point, as you know, is this distinction which has been put forward by Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid, according to which external senses have a double province. That is, they make us feel and to make us perceive. And the feeling, that is the sensation, is associated with the fact that stimuli could be pleasant, painful, or indifferent. That is, they have a valence, and at the same time, perception provides us with this conception and belief of the existence of external objects. And the idea that the sensation and perception that usually in everyday experience are strictly related, but they can be separated in some circumstances, has been proved with the discovery by the blind sight phenomenon by Nick Humphrey. So my question is, from the evolutionary point of view, is why and when there should have been appeared the double province of the senses? And it seems to me, again, it's not novel in itself, but it's novel with respect to the distinction between sensation and perception, that the crucial point should have been active movement by organism. This is a famous example of the Ascidian tunicates, which has been described for the first time, I think, by neurobiologist Rodolfo Linas. And these are sessile, immobile, and permanently attached to rocks. They live on the ocean floor. But this after metamorphosis, because before, when they were in the larval stage, the Ascidias have a primitive brain. They can swim in the environment. And when they found a substrate, a rock or other, they adhere to the substrate, and they become sessile. And at this point, the first thing they do is to get rid of the brain, which is no longer necessary. Obviously, you know, there is the story that this is the metaphor for the academics professor, that when they get tenure, they get rid of the brain, but anyway. So why this should be a transition important with respect to perception and sensation? Well, very simple, because of the so-called worm dilemma, which has been well described by Björn Merker. Consider the worm. You extract from the terrain a worm and you touch it. The cutaneous stimulation would produce a sort of defensive reaction or response, not surprise. But the point is that the very same cutaneous stimulation is occurring when the animal is in its environment and moving under the terrain. So how can it distinguish it? And it is the general problem of the double province of the senses. If I move my arm and go to touch with the finger this microphone, this object, obviously I get some local stimulation. But if my eyes are closed and ask to a friend to do the same, move the microphone and to touch my finger, there will be exactly the same stimulation locally. But you can't distinguish between the two. And we know how this distinction can be done. We know from the 50s of previous centuries, thanks to the work of Erich von Holst and Roger Sperry, that developed this beautiful idea of the efference copy, namely the idea that every time the brain sends a motor command, there is also a carbon copy of that signal which is sent to the sensory system. And this is in every textbooks, obviously, in neuroscience. But I think that we can try to move a little bit from this form of description of the efference copy, making some simple experimental phenomenology. Consider again the example I mentioned. So in one case, I move my finger and I touch the microphone. If you look at your experience is, in this case, is mainly perception. That is, you feel that there is an object out there. But in the condition in which you are blindfolded and the friend is moving the microphone and touching your finger, your impression is that there is something happening to you. It's more sensation-like. It can change on the basis of the attention, but the difference is quite clear, I think. So let's imagine, to take seriously Nick Humphrey's hypothesis, namely that at the start, the very primitive response of the organism was a local bodily reaction. Local bodily reaction, it means that it is a motor responses. And if it is a motor responses, there should be an efference copy related, associated with it. And it is this motor part which is compared, not with the sensory part, but with the other motoric action carried out by an organism. So in this case, for instance, when you move and touch the microphone, the movement of the hand is associated with an efference copy that would annihilate it, the efferences copy associated with the local bodily reaction. locally in the place of it, of the cutaneous stimulation, thus giving rise to the perception an object out there without sensation move, mostly. When the object is moving and hits the finger, in the absence of active hand movement, there is no efference copy to annihilate the efference copy associated with local bodily reaction. Thus, a sensation, what is happening to me, arises. What is fascinating to me of this model is that it is amenable in principle to empirical research, because we know, particularly in invertebrates, the mechanisms which are associated with the efference copy, and so we have the possibility, for instance, to block them. And my idea is that if we are able, I'm working on this, but I don't have any data to show, if we are able to have a condition in which an animal has to categorize a stimulus as it is there or it is not there, and we block the mechanism for the efference copy, I would expect that they are able to behave coherently like a blindside patient towards the object, but without the feeling. And so in the categorization task, it would say there is nothing. As I said, I have not any empirical data on that, but I can try to provide a metaphoric and poetic description. This very famous statement by Borges, who said that the aesthetic phenomenon he described as the imminence of a revelation which does not occur. If you change aesthetic phenomenon, it is taken from Dante, by the way. If you change aesthetic phenomenon with consciousness, you have sort of idea what I'm thinking about this. Because obviously the movement, the efference copy associated with the movement of the arm is occurring before the cutaneous stimulation. So you have to imagine that this signal is delayed in some way, like in Riker detectors of this mechanism. And the other efference copy associated with the bodily reaction is in the comparador waiting for the imminence of a revelation. If the revelation arrives, the efference copy related to the fact that I move the arm, then it is annihilated. If it is not, for a very short period of time, the quantum momentum of the psychological present, there will be the thick experience of experiencing something. Well, if you have any interest in this kind of things, particularly related to the origin of knowledge, maybe you could be interested to look at my little book. Thank you very much for your attention.